Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, October 20th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about Joe Manchin and the possibility of him leaving the Democratic Party. No, this is not another April Fool's joke. This is a legitimate concern by the Democratic operatives that seem to have revealed that Joe Manchin has been under consideration about leaving the Democratic Party. Now, before you take this as a situation in which either your party ends up in the majority or your party ends up in the minority, do not take much of this report as actual substantive fact. I think that the first thing that you need to understand is that this report, even though it will be completely pushed out there by the media the same way I am pushing it out there to you now, I do want to clarify though, because a lot of media companies probably won't tell you this, is that these are just reports. This is not an accurate, or not necessarily not accurate, this is not something that actually comes from Joe Manchin. This is just merely what has been said. And a lot of times, also not to say that this isn't legitimate, because a lot of the times what does happen within the Senate chambers and what happens within the Senate congressional offices, whatever it might be, a lot of those reports do end up being true. But in this specific case, I really do not think it will be, and I think that that's why I want to preface this by saying, while there is some type of understanding that typically speaking reports, if they are published out into very large media outlets like they are right now, a lot of the time they do have some type of substantive evidence behind them, and potentially it will follow through. But in this specific case, this is not the first time we have seen Joe Manchin, quote-unquote, under consideration about leaving the Democratic Party ever since he's been in the United States Senate. This has been a consideration. 2017, they mentioned it. Even right after Donald Trump won the election, there was a lot of talk about how supposedly Joe Manchin was considering leaving the Democratic Party. I just want to say that at the end of this year, at the end of next year, Joe Manchin will more than likely be a Democrat. And if he does end up becoming an independent, I can largely see him siding with the Democratic Party, because at the end of the day, the majority of his votes in the United States Senate have almost always been for the Democratic Party, and I think it would just be very out of character to see him move down this pathway. So, no, I am not trying to mess with you. What happened here was essentially, this was released 7 minutes ago, and I saw it on Twitter, and I was actually quite surprised. Normally, you see this discussion circulate around the more left-wing part of Twitter that believes he should switch political parties. In their eyes, I think that a lot of the argument is being made that if he's not voting hard line with the Democratic Party, what's the point of him being a Democrat anyway? Well, of course, the concern is that the United States Senate would completely shift in terms of its balance of power if Joe Manchin was to switch over. West Virginia going completely red would give the Republican Party the majority, and Democrats could do absolutely nothing in order to combat that situation. In fact, if Joe Manchin was to technically switch political parties, Democrats would not be able to win in West Virginia again in the foreseeable future without some type of extremely strong Democrat, and unfortunately, they have been all tapped out. So looking at our 50-50 map here in the United States Senate, the Democratic Party really needs to ensure that this does not become a reality. And I think that all signs right now indicate that it is not going to become a reality. Primarily speaking, the media outlets that have picked up on this are typically right-leaning sources, or at least the sources that tend to pick up on these reports earlier on than the mainstream media. And again, a lot of the time you will see me use these websites, and eventually 2 days later, there's a CNN and Fox News article that has been reviewed consistently, versus this one, which seems to go out a lot quicker and is a lot more pressing in terms of the subject matter. So again, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not, but in this case, pretty much this entire video is going to be explaining why I think that this is just a move that is being done by members of the Republican Party and members of media sources that are really trying to push this narrative, because number one, it does generate a lot of attention, but also number two, because they might believe to themselves that Joe Manchin could actually switch political parties. But like I said, this is not the first time that this has been brought up. In fact, earlier on this year, if you remember back during my April Fool's joke, a lot of you guys said that you believed that this would happen, but some people didn't believe it. And I think that that was, while the minuscule part of the amount of cases, I also do think that it is probably the most likeliest scenario that Joe Manchin remains a Democrat throughout the rest of his term. And he actually spoke on it back in April of 2021, not before my April Fool's video, but afterwards, saying that he's never even considered it from that standpoint, talking about the possibility of him switching political parties. He has faced pressure about it from a lot of people. You have seen Mitch McConnell consider the possibility. Even though he says he never expects Joe Manchin to switch political parties, there has been that discussion. In addition, back in 2017, President Trump supposedly called Joe Manchin to get him to switch political parties. In fact, the Wall Street Journal has been actively pushing this type of idea. In their most recent one, not this one. This is a Wall Street Journal opinion. I believe there was a different one about him being able to, Donald Trump. Yes, the Washington Post, not Wall Street Journal. The Washington Post had this article that was released on their opinions about how President Trump can flip the Senate with one phone call. And it actually isn't this simple. This was released back in June of 2021, and it pretty much just said throughout the entire article that Donald Trump could flip the Senate by convincing Joe Manchin to switch political parties. Well, Joe Manchin has already said that President Trump has called on him to switch political parties in the past. When Jim Justice switched political parties from Democrat to Republican in the state of West Virginia, it was big news because it was bringing up the possibility that Democrats could have lost Joe Manchin as well. And the reason why that was under consideration was because Joe Manchin was in this position where he was about to run for re-election, and he could have fared a little bit better as a Republican than he did as a Democrat. But of course, he pushed down this idea and said that, no, I'm not going to switch political parties. And I think at that point in time, that was absolutely his stance. Do I think that's his stance today? I also think that is his stance today. Joe Manchin was elected as a Democrat in 2012 with 61% of the vote. Being a Democrat in West Virginia might seem to be a political death sentence when it comes down to any other race, but Joe Manchin was different. He was the governor of the state and won by an extremely large margin when you're talking about that 2012, at least compared to what Mitt Romney's victory was over Barack Obama. And then in the special election in West Virginia, Joe Manchin ran for this seat, which he actually appointed a Democrat to this position. He appointed the Democrat. He did not appoint himself in this vacancy. He decided that he would choose someone, but we pretty much knew that Joe Manchin wasn't going to run. Goodwin pledged to not run for this election seat, in exchange for the appointment. So Joe Manchin sort of knew that he wanted to run in the United States Senate, and he ended up doing so. Now, when you look at this race, it was not held by a Republican before. This was held by Robert Byrd. So in 2010, that's why there was a special election, and thus there needed to be a regular election in 2012. Well, it ended up being the same nominee in both elections, but 2012 was a much better year for Joe Manchin across this map. But then in 2018, it actually ended up being pretty close, which is why I made the comment that yes, he might have done better as a Republican, considering that people still adored him, regardless of what type of political party. Many of these Republicans see a lot of the headlines across the national media about how Joe Manchin is throttling and holding up the Democratic Party, and a lot of them positively respond to that. Joe Manchin maintains his popularity largely because he's viewed as an obstructionist for the Democratic Party, and considered that his seat matters the most out of anyone at this point in time, because that seat is not going to be won by Democrats in the foreseeable future, means that he holds all the leverage, which also means that he's not going to switch political parties. The thing about senators and representatives is that they always want to be the center of attention. For Joe Manchin's sake, he is the center of attention. Look at every single one of these articles talking about the possibility of Joe Manchin switching political parties. When they ask him time and time again, when he's getting all these articles written about him, you don't see this written about my Senator Chris Van Hollen. You don't see this written about a random, senator out in the West, a senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden. You don't see these articles written about these senators that are party line voters with the Democratic Party. Joe Manchin has leverage over the Democrats because he could vote with the GOP and effectively end any bill that the Democratic Party wants to pass. But if he becomes a Republican, there will be no leverage over the Democratic Party, and he would no longer have any type of seniority. He would no longer have any type of preference within the Republican Party. As soon as he switches over, he becomes the most moderate Republican there is. But in the Democratic Party, he becomes the most conservative Democrat that there is. So when you switch over to the GOP, it's like swinging over to the exact opposite side of the spectrum, except this time you are in the minority. And because you have not been within the Republican Party for quite some time, you're not going to get anything that you want. You're not going to lead it. You are not going to hold leverage over the Republican Party. Yes, you could technically say, I might side back with the Democratic Party, but that completely negates the point of joining the GOP in the first place. If you back the Republican Party in the majority of issues, which he does not, but if he was to, then you would be fine with them being in the majority. But to try to hold this over their heads after switching political parties will just make Joe Manchin seem like he's doing it solely for himself. But in West Virginia, at least, the point is right now that he's doing it for the sake of West Virginia citizens. At least that's the way I think it comes across to the citizens in this state. But when you take a look at what would happen if he was to be a Republican version, obstructionist for the GOP, West Virginia, a state that voted for Donald Trump by 40 points, would not necessarily be too happy about that. So he really only benefits by being a Democrat and has only won as a Democrat in the past. It wouldn't make sense for Joe Manchin to switch political parties. But then again, there is some type of history behind presidents that need certain votes having switches in the United States Senate. For instance, back in 2009, I think, Senator Arlen Specter, a long-lasting Republican, decided to switch to the Democratic Party, giving the Democrats 60 votes in the United States Senate. Now, that was not long-lasting. That lasted for a few months, and then I believe Ted Kennedy passed away months later, or actually maybe nearly a year later. I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that that election was very quick, and it was a Republican victory at the end of it. But the point being that before then, the Democrats had reached 60 because this Republican had decided to switch to the Democratic Party, and it shifted everything across the nation. Arlen Specter was praised by Barack Obama, and Democrats were very happy with this position. But he ultimately ended up losing his primary in 2010. When he ran in this Senate election, he ran against Joe Sestak. Now, who was Joe Sestak? Well, he was a congressman. He was someone that was a known name across Pennsylvania, but Arlen Specter was as well. Throughout the beginning of the primary season, Arlen Specter had a pretty large lead over Joe Sestak. But by the time we reached the Democratic primary, Joe Sestak ended up winning that primary. And thus, Arlen Specter, as the incumbent, was knocked out of the race through a mere primary, even though he was the sole reason why Democrats were able to pass many pieces of legislation through his last-minute effort, because I say sole reason not to discount the 59 other votes that allowed it to pass, but I say it to point out that if he had not switched political parties and had not voted with the Democrats, a lot less would have gotten done in the United States Senate, and the possibility and the ideas of it all would have all been suppressed because they knew that they wouldn't be able to do it. So obviously the 59 other senators that worked hard for their seats and voted in a certain way absolutely deserve credit if they are to be applauded for what they do. Again, I'm not trying to take a side on what was passed or what wasn't passed, but the point being that without Arlen Specter's switch, it would not have been able to have been moving so smoothly, and the realm of possibility would have been really shortened across this very pivotal time for American history. But looking at Arlen Specter, it ultimately ended up backfiring. I mean, he could have won re-election in 2010 as a Republican, especially given the circumstances of the year. Joe Sestak came pretty close. Had Arlen Specter been that Democratic nominee, I also think he could have won. But it was because he switched political parties into a party that didn't necessarily like him in the first place. He got 46% of the vote, which is actually a very good showing for someone who used to be a Republican. I think that goes to show that, yes, he had a significant amount of Democratic support, but it was not the majority of voters across that. And they even were going so far as to deny an incumbent who would offer some type of electoral advantage in the state of Pennsylvania. I think if Joe Manchin was to switch political parties, it would only be near the 2024 election cycle, and even then, I really don't think that he would be able to do well in the Republican primary there. Donald Trump has already vilified Joe Manchin to the fullest extent, but Joe Manchin has been able, luckily enough for him, to hold off a lot of those vicious attacks from the right wing in a state like West Virginia. West Virginia is one of those states where Donald Trump is adored. In fact, it is the largest margin of victory for a Republican across the United States on the presidential map that we have seen in the 21st century. West Virginia was hard to the right, and Donald Trump was able to capitalize on that. I think that was something that needs to be pointed out. 2016's margin was a little bit higher than it was in 2020. But the point being that West Virginia is a state that loves President Trump, but Joe Manchin has been lucky enough to hold off that type of attack. Obviously it got much closer than it was back in 2012. You're talking 61 to 37 versus 50 versus 46. So yes, it is a margin that I wouldn't say the Democrat here, Joe Manchin, should be super enthusiastic about, but it definitely is a good showing considering how Republican this state actually is. And at the end of the day, Joe Manchin only benefits by being a Democrat. And seeing articles like this one, yes, of course, there is that speculation, but there has been that speculation for quite some time. There has been that speculation. And, for him to be talking about over the past couple of months, saying that it does not seem to be a good idea, and that he has not considered even switching political parties, goes enough to show that he will not be switching political parties. I think that this right now is really very much a pipe dream for the Republican Party. That's why I made a joke about it back in April. I thought this was something that could be laughable about because we knew that he wasn't going to switch political parties. I think the Democratic Party's faith in him is very low right now, but he has stuck to his values over the past few elections. In addition to that, he has also said consistently over the past year, in 2021 alone, that he would not be switching political parties, and that he has not given any thought to it either, saying that this was never even within a possible position for Joe Manchin. So I think he's going to stay within the Democratic Party. I think that he's going to keep the Democrats in that 50-50 majority, largely because it benefits him the most out of anyone, but also I still think that, when you're talking about Joe Manchin as a person, he still represents a lot of what, a West Virginia Democrat would be like in the United States Senate. And while many Democrats may disagree with him in terms of policy, in terms of voting, he's the reason why the majority is staying. And if he was to flip, that would screw over the Democratic Party infinitely and make it very difficult for them to win in 2022 with a Republican-controlled Senate. So I would say that the Democrats should be at least happy that he's not switching political parties, but I don't necessarily think they should be super scared about the possibility of it because he has had more than one opportunity over the past year and way more than that over the past 10 years. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.